Hey listeners, it's your host Dacia. Before I get started, I have to give a shout out to Kenneth Broberg. He is a Van Cliburn International Piano Competition finalist, and he comes from right here on the campus where Classical Classroom is made. He's at the U of H Moore School of Music, so Kenneth, good luck, buddy. We'll be keeping an eye out for what happens there. Also, you're about to hear my chat with Jessica Meyer, who started out as a violist and moved into composition because she just had something to say. And I really like that about Jessica. She's actually got a really inspiring story, and I think you're going to enjoy it. And when you do, harness the power of that inspiration and take it on over to iTunes and subscribe to us, rate us, and review us. Do it for the children. Or us. Or whatever. Okay, enjoy the episode. There's a rumor going around that classical music can be hoity-toity. But here in the Classical Classroom, we beg to differ.
Beethoven 5.
The idea that classical music is a zone where we have to feel restricted or we have to act in a certain way, that's not going to be helpful going forward.
Isaiah is shaking with excitement here. I mean, there's just so many great parts of the opera.
He asked me to play his favorite spot in the first movement of the Brahms. And then he said, I started using those licks in my guitar solos.
It's how to be classical music rock stars, because there's not enough of that in this business.
Occasionally I would plug in the mandolin to my distortion pedals.
I don't change my voice.
Talking to classical music.
I'm playing classical music now. I mean, it's the same 12 notes. That's what's so cool about it.
I'm Dacia Clay, a classical music newbie, and I'm trying to learn all I can about the music. Come learn with me and the classical music experts I invite into the Classical Classroom. Hello everyone, and welcome to the Classical Classroom. I'm Dacia Clay, and joining me from the the cat-friendly Radio Foundation in New York is Jessica Meyer. She is a composer, a performer, and an educator. Her work has been commissioned by the Nautilus Brass Quintet American Guca. What on earth? I just made up words. That was great. Let me try that. Sentence again in English. Her work has been commissioned by the Nautilus Brass Quintet, Amanda Gukin, who we've also had on the show, and many more. She moves between many styles, from Baroque to jazz to her solo work, in which she uses a loop pedal and electronics. Her teaching workshops have been featured at places like Juilliard and the Curtis Institute. Jessica Meyer, welcome to the Classical Classroom.
Hi, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so we got to get right to it because you've got quite a story, and I am interested first in your story. You started out as a violist, but you became a composer. How did you start, and then how did you get from one to the other?
Okay, well, in all fairness, I think when I was 5, I was already composing, but just not in the official sense. It was me just sitting at the piano, making a lot of stuff up day in, day out to try to either pass the time while my mom had tea with her friend, or in kindergarten, back when kindergarten classes still had pianos in them. But then when I was 9, in public school out in Long Island, we were all given the choice of what instrument to play, and I wanted to play the violin, but they said, no, we ran out, but you're tall, so we're going to give you the viola. And so I just sort of focused on that for a very long time, and I wrote a lot of music in high school using computers, and I improvised a lot. But as soon as conservatory auditions came up, my mind just switched over to learning how to play viola on the highest level possible, because all I thought was orchestra job. That's what I love, playing orchestra. Yeah. And I specifically sought out teachers that focused on that kind of repertoire. And I got to Juilliard to study with Bill Linzer, and I mean, excerpts were what I did. And I really, honest to God, thought that that's what my life was going to be. And after graduating and taking some auditions, I realized that maybe going to the middle of nowhere and getting an orchestra job is maybe not in the cards. I loved playing a lot of new music by other living composers. I started a new music ensemble called Counterinduction, and we've been in New York since 1999, doing our own seasons of many, many composers. And I just reached this sort of point in my life where I was wondering why I wasn't feeling very complete. And I also needed an outlet to process all of what was going on in my life. And that's when I first started doing what I did when I was 5, was improvising on a piano. And then I just started writing it down. Mm-hmm. And then I just started really writing for viola and the loop pedal, because using a loop pedal, it repeats back whatever you're putting into it, so you can build pieces quite easily. And I just used everything I learned as a new music performer in New York for the 15 years prior, playing everybody else's pieces, and just applied those sounds that I sort of fell in love with over the years to what I was writing for Looper. And then soon after that, a couple of years later, people started asking me to write them things. And then I started realizing that that's really what I needed to be doing, along with still playing. But it's definitely has taken over as a huge part of my life.
And I want to ask you about your writing process, but before we do that, I'm wondering how that was received. Like, were you able to easily sort of transition? I mean, I know that you still play viola, you're still performing, but how was that received in the classical community? What, like, you're moving between those worlds of performing and composing?
Well, I think that on the outset of the academical world, since I didn't officially study, I'm sure that
you didn't officially study composition.
Composition.
Yeah.
I'm sure it's all immediately met with some degree of skepticism. But at the same time, I'm working at a disadvantage already, because all of the sort of official competitions, per se, for composers are mostly for 35 and under, and I'm in my 40s already. So I already didn't have the usual means of trying to be introduced to the composing world. I'm writing for colleagues, and I'm writing for colleagues who are great players and who are wanting to play my things, and so then they get it out there. So my career is happening because I'm deeply committed to it. I know it's part of me that I need to not ignore anymore, but also I'm fortunate enough to have enough years in the business to have a network of colleagues that I know. And that so that when I introduce them to my music, and if it's something they want to collaborate on, we just make it happen.
So I find this kind of interesting because, you know, when I think about other kinds of music that I'm sort of more familiar with than classical, the playing of an instrument and the writing of the music are kind of one and the same. And, you know, like, you know, you get together and you jam as a band, and I'm sure, you know, that there are bands out there who are actually sitting down and composing their music. But I think that most rock music, often jazz music, comes from playing the music. Like it's just that whole process. And what you're talking about is more aligned with that sort of model that I'm familiar with. Whereas most of the composers that I talk to in the classical music world, it's like, you know, they sit down and they actually like write the music, and then someone else plays it. So yeah.
And I think, but it wasn't always like that at all. And I think we've only come to this kind of schism in the past 100 years. Whereas Bach wrote his stuff, he played his stuff. Mozart, Beethoven, you know, Paganini, Liszt, all Tchaikovsky, they all very much played, and they wrote. So it's only been mostly 20th century music where you started seeing the schism of people who are writing that didn't have any kind of performing career. And sometimes that worked out fine, and quite honestly, sometimes it didn't work out fine. And I think that's why there's a resurgence right now in a lot of performer composers, and about performers feeling like if they have something to say, what's wrong with sitting down and writing it and saying it? Yeah. There's also a lot of times over the past, you know, going to soon be 20 years with my new music ensemble, with working with other composers, and just, you know, notice basic things, how scores are put together, how idiomatic the writing is for the instrument. You know, was this written for a keyboard, or was this really written for a French horn? The expectations of instruments. And it was always a pet peeve of mine as a performer when I look at a part. I'm like, is this person really thinking of a viola or something else. And so that's why it's also still a pet peeve of mine as a composer. I don't want to hand anybody a part that's not idiomatic for them to play.
Yeah.
And there's also been a trend over a certain many years to make music more difficult than it needs to be for the sake of difficulty. and I feel like I'd rather keep certain things simple, but yet the emotional content very differently. And I mean, you can argue about this with a lot of modern artists, people that are choosing to do things simply or more complicatedly and what they're trying to express. And it's really, at the end of the day, it's none of our business. It's what the artist really wants to do. But I know that firsthand that if people are going to play my music, I need to make sure that I'm writing it down the best way possible and writing about things that I could figure out a way. How can I take what's in my head and make it relatable to others so that they can then go ahead and play it and advocate for it?
Yeah.
And so that's sort of the position where I'm at as a composer.
You said a couple of things in there that piqued my interest. One was that you were talking about when there was the schism with 20th century composers where you didn't so much have the performer composer. You had people who did not have a performance career who were composing. And you said that in some cases that worked out perfectly fine and then in others not so much. So I'm curious, what is sort of best case scenario? What's like a great example of how that did work out, and what's a less good example of that?
Well, let's see. I feel like good examples are, people who Carolyn Shaw, who wrote the partita, who for A Room Full of Teeth, who won the Pulitzer a couple of years ago. When you listen to that, that's someone very clearly who's developed a vocal vocabulary with this amazing group of singers and using it for very clear expressive purposes. And it worked. And because she's one of the singers, she's not trying to come up with a bunch of sounds for the sake of a bunch of sounds. She's doing it for a clear purpose because she sung them herself. And I'm not saying that everybody has to be able to play the instrument that they're writing for, but they do have to, I feel like they have to be aware of what it's like to be on stage and perform something and to get the musical and expressive sounds that they want out of an instrument. I mean, there are many people rolling around who are doing that, like Andy Akiho. Again, he's a percussionist. And he's out there. I'm thinking way back to Paul Hindemith, who was a violist who would show up and he can get off a train and play a new viola sonata that he just wrote on the train, but also writing for orchestra so skillfully. And I mean, I feel like that's all depending on what their early nascent musical experiences were.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm not saying one has to be one or the other, but there's definitely, I've worked with composers who we played for them and they're like, that's awesome. And it was nothing what was written on the page. And that frustrates me to no end, that I feel like people should hear what, the difference. And because the sheer amount of hours that we'll sit in a room by ourselves and practice and give up so much of our lives to learn a particular part and then go play at a concert and it might not make a difference. And that just, musicians' lives are hard enough. So I feel like making them any harder unnecessarily, but then again, you have the converse of that. You have a lot of artists where it's like, well, no, I just want the energy of all of this difficulty in one place and see what happens, and that's the art. So I think everybody makes art for different reasons and everyone performs art for different reasons. And I've just, over the past so many years, decided on what my own rules are about that, and I'm just trying to live them accordingly. That's something that I've talked to a lot of performers about. Is like, we'll be talking about some very difficult violin concerto or something like that, and my question to them is, why on earth
would you want to play something like that? They're describing how difficult it is and how you have to be at, 3 different places on the violin at once, and you have to develop like Spider-Man fingers and and I'm like, but why? Why would you do that? And the answer is usually because this is fun for me. Because I strangely like this kind of challenge in my life, but I think
it keeps you on your toes.
Yeah,
because I have a colleague of mine, Eric Moe, who's a wonderful composer, and he wrote me a piece for viola and tape, which is kind of like the hardest viola concerto on steroids. Really, in some ways, it is profoundly fast.
Yeah,
and whenever I have to brush it off, I have to start 6 weeks prior, playing everything very slowly, and know it because it bounces all over the place in the viola. And the CD will come out sometime next year, and you can listen to it. And it's insane to listen to. But he's a dear friend of mine. I do love playing the piece when I can make time to work it up. And it's true. It gives you mad chops at the end. Like it's like I just completed the Olympics. Like I can play anything after that. And then sadly, if I put the viola in a case for a couple of weeks, I go back and then suddenly you can't play it all again.
Yeah.
But there is a certain sense of accomplishment to tackling things that are very hard. That's not the issue that I have. I have an issue with doing things that are very hard and it can't be audibly noticeable.
Right. Well, and it sounds to me like more at issue with what you're saying is like, to what end? Like, what is this? What is this giving to the performer and to the audience to have done this incredible feat of playing this really difficult thing? And if it's not getting some emotion,
some joy,
or story, or joy across, then really, what is the point? And so that kind of brings us to your music that you're writing now, and I think that we should maybe hear some of this music that you've been writing. What have you been working on? And tell us about a piece, and we can give a piece a listen.
Well, I think we should probably start with one of my loop pieces. Source of Joy is something I wrote a few years ago. I did it for my TED Talk because it was, kind of going back to what people write about. Why are people artists? And the first rule of thumb is like, write what you know, write what makes you happy.
Yeah.
And what gives you pleasure, and so I wanted to write a piece of music with all my favorite sounds, and it was afterwards I realized that these are not the kinds of sounds that people think of the viola for. And I happen to especially love really groovy music, and I love really crazy, high, fun solos to play, and all of my sort of new music sounds, like harmonics and things like that, are in here. And so, that was the enabling constraint I had when I started to write for myself, is that with a loop pedal, there's only so many things I can do. I can shut it on and off. I can only remove the last layer that I enter. And so how do I create contrast within that? How do I create structures within pieces? How do I keep the rate of which the sounds are changing interesting enough and at a pace that's satisfying to both myself and the listener?
Yeah.
So that was sort of my challenge to myself.
Yeah.
With all the pieces I've written for myself for Loop Machine is how can I make these all sound different? How could they all sound different? How could they all say different things? And how many different compositional techniques can I develop for this one piece of equipment?
I like it. So let's, why don't you introduce us to a particular piece and tell us what's going on in the music since you've employed all of these different techniques.
Okay. So this is Source of Joy. And then again, this is from just me and a guitar loop pedal called the Boss Loop Station. It's an old one, an XL20. So this is one of the things I can do with the looper is that I could start with one basic pattern and then insert other patterns within the pattern to make things more complicated as it goes. And then I found, it's called hocketing, and then I found that that's actually something I do a lot in my music that I write for other people also, because it's a way to keep things rhythmically interesting.
So it sounds like you've created 2 loops and then that you're playing over those loops.
Yeah, so all the pizzicatos you hear, all the plucking in the background, that was a combination of all these, like about 5 different layers I did.
Yeah.
Because that thing at the end, right here, like that's physically impossible to play in real life. But if I put it in the looper that way, you can insert notes within other notes and get this rhythm. But then I can solo on top of it. And now here, I've started to add a whole bunch of stuff, and which takes us to the climax of the piece right about here.
It's cool. It reminds me, for some reason, of a piece that I heard by that was played by So Percussion.
I love those guys.
It was played on the chord sticks. I think it was a piece composed by Bryce Dessner. It sounds like it's got that Americana sort of sound to it, a little bit, which is interesting.
I tend to do a lot of modal writing because...
What does that mean, modal?
Modal, okay, so instead of having a series of chord changes, I can't, unless I enter chord changes into the harmony while I'm writing, and then loop those same exact changes all the time, I have to always have the harmony be a certain pattern. Whereas here, I could have a tapestry of notes that are somewhat of one chord, and then when I want it to change the tapestry a little bit, I just add one note, and it changes the feel of it. So like for instance, so instead of having like a lot of blues would be like a C chord, an F chord, a G chord, a C chord, 1 4 5 1. A lot of rock and rolls like that. Whereas a long time ago, people would write and a piece of music would be in a mode. So in other words, it's going to be a scale. And this scale's used through the whole thing, and you might start in different places of the scale, but you know that the scale has all the white notes except for maybe B flat, that like one black note on the piano, and you would just use that as your harmonic grounding.
Gotcha.
But so it created an interesting problem, but served as a really good enabling constraint of like, how can I write stuff that develops harmonically without setting chord progressions that are going to loop through the entire piece? And then I found that sort of, taking one note and just shifting it slightly and taking another note and shifting it in another direction, that I find myself also doing that in the acoustic works I write for others also. So it's interesting how a lot of sort of the choices I've made here, I take into writing for others, but I just have I could breathe a sigh of relief because I have that freedom of basically making the sound do whatever I want and not have to worry about, the pedal and what it does and what it doesn't do.
I had said earlier that I wanted to talk about your writing process, and we never did. So we should talk about that. You've recorded works. I know that you did just because you want to do for yourself, and then you've also written works for yourself, and you've also written works that were commissioned by others. Maybe a good way to talk about your writing process is to talk about how that is different, how writing for yourself and how writing for others is different.
when I'm writing for myself and looper, I'm automatically on my instrument and I'm improvising ideas and immediately using the looper as repeating back to me whatever I did. I'm building things on the spot, and often I'm just recording little bits of what I do on my phone, listening back. I'm like, okay, that worked.
Yeah.
I've written whole pieces where it's just an improv. I've learned the hard way, always record whatever I play. So I'll just, be in one of those moods and just put the phone on, and sometimes a whole piece comes out, or sometimes just a fraction of the piece comes out. So writing for looper is way faster. Writing for other people, I'm either at the piano trying to feel where the chords should go. Often I'm singing melodies into my phone and writing them out afterwards, and then sort of putting all of those things together in an engraving software like Sibelius so that I can also have the immediate playback of how things go while keeping mindful of what's idiomatic and what's not. So, but I do like writing on the computer because I could hear where all the harmonies are going, and when I don't have enough fingers to play piano, because so much of my stuff is improv based when I'm generating material. What happens when I'm on my viola and on the piano is that my fingers just tend to go where they're used to going, as opposed to really hearing the sounds in my head.
I gotcha.
So singing is the best way to capture the sounds in my head without relying upon technique, and recording those ideas, and then using notation software to play back ideas for me to see if they work in a particular sequence and to hear what the harmonies are doing. Because when I'm not writing melodically, I'm writing very viscerally, a lot of gestures and a lot of texture. Gestures meaning like how the sweep of the rhythm goes for any particular length of time, and textures meaning I'm profoundly interested in resonance. So how instruments ring really, really fascinates me. And that leads to another piece of music called The Dappled Light Just Beyond Her Skin, where I was writing about an afternoon I spent in a lake house, and I was on the couch and the sun was coming through the trees and just falling through the window, and just that idea of light. And I immediately thought of the vibraphone. And my friend Sam Solomon basically wrote the book on how to write for percussion. And I saw a video where he's just adjusting the knob, and the vibrations are getting slower and faster. And I thought, oh, that'd be perfect for this.
What is that sound?
So that's the flute blowing across the instrument but not making an actual pitch.
Okay.
Same thing for bass clarinet. He's blowing into the instrument without the mouthpiece. And this is the viola, which is me. So what was fun? We recorded this summer in France at one of those. I think it was 11th century chapel in the middle of the French countryside, where in Avillard, where they have this new music festival. So again, as far as like performer composers go, it was one of those things where they're like, well, we want you to come as a composer. And I thought, well, I'd like to, but it would also, I really also need to play. You know, I'll play all the rest of the pieces, but if you guys can play my piece, they're like, sure, totally. And so we're there, and so I get to play with the ensemble and, you know, tweak the piece as we go about what works, what doesn't work. And so it's nice to be able to do that when they're your colleagues.
Yeah.
And you're like, I'm looking for this sound, and then they're like, oh, actually try this, or try this, or try this, and then we come, you know, we build something together. And
you
it's
have like
really
access to that language with your colleagues.
Yes.
Yeah.
Which I find is deeply satisfying.
Yeah. I'm interested too. You know, a lot of the classical music that we talk about on this show, a lot of the classical music that I'm familiar with is about big, lofty concepts from literature or mythology, or it's, you know, absolute music, and it's just about the music itself. And your music seems different in that you seem to be telling stories from your own life. I don't hear a lot of autobiography and memoir in classical music. That's interesting to me.
Well, I kind of was going with why I started to write to begin with. Most of all, I've as a child and as an adult, I'm mostly processing different emotions by writing them out sonically. And either certain interpersonal situations I find myself in my adult life, or just general things I'm trying to work out for myself. And sometimes not. I mean, in a piece like Luminosity, like the brass quartet, it was just basically the idea of light and permeating light, and how the energy of people, you know, when you have somebody come in a room that has that kind of light within them and they infect everything around them, you know, it's a sort of brightness. And I'm like, how can I capture that with sound? But more often than not, I am usually writing about emotions, or I'm taking a quote from something specific and using that as a basis of sort of like a little story, if you will, a narrative that I don't want to prescribe too much to the listener. I want them to bring their own kind of things of whatever's going on in their life to it. But I guess it's, you know, I kind of am writing from, in a way, like a singer-songwriter point of view. You know, I've had this experience. I'm going to sing about it, and you probably had something like this too, and you could probably relate to it in that way. Yeah.
What is a piece where you started with a quote?
But Not Until. So it's a David Foster Wallace. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the truth will set you free, but not until it's finished with you.
That's a great quote.
It's the story of my life. So I wrote a piece of music that goes with that, and Andrew Yee of the Attacca Quartet graciously came in for this other radio show and recorded it with me, actually only a week and a half ago. Wow. And that's up on SoundCloud right now, if you want to listen to it.
Yeah, let's give it a listen. Are you using a loop here, or is this actually two separate instruments? I can't tell.
No, it's viola and cello.
Oh, right, okay.
But they're sort of two... And to be honest, it was originally a viola duo piece. But I love how later on it just sort of explodes and it drops down into this really bassy thing that, you know, I like writing with very close harmony like this, so that the sounds rub up against each other in that sort of uncomfortable way. And really, I like exploring all the different kinds of ranges instruments have, because sometimes and this is a case for why make things difficult. But like sometimes really high up on an instrument, there's such this wonderful tension in what happens to the sound, and so I tend to love to exploit how high and fragile an instrument can sound. Like the cello here, you can't even tell it's a cello. Like this is a cello solo.
Oh, wow.
So that's another thing I think I carried over from the looping is because I got to play with a microphone all the time, I got to discover all these different beautiful sounds I can make without having to try hard to project. Because the viola is this, there's a lot of jokes about the viola for a reason. I mean, sometimes, because it's not as brilliant as a violin, it's not low and juicy like a cello, but also it's got problems acoustically because if it was the right size, it would be way too big to hold acoustically for it to work. So when I'm playing chamber music, if I'm playing for a piano quartet like I'm going to do next month, I have to play really close to the bridge often, just for my sound to cut through a piano, a violin, and a cello.
Huh.
I have to have a very focused sound a lot of the time.
Yeah.
So what I tried to... when I worked with a looper, I can play these super, super airy sounds that have innately their own expressivity in them.
Yeah.
Because I don't have to worry about projecting. And so then I started carrying that around in my string work when writing for strings. Like, how can I find all the different colors that are possible for strings and just not worry about if it's going to have to cut through an orchestra or a string quartet or whatever.
So
but
you're going to need to tap into this whole different side of the viola.
Yes, which I love. But if we listen to the end of this piece, you could hear how when the cello really comes in and you know it's a cello.
Yeah.
And then he's way up there again. Because this is this point in the piece where it's like you're putting all this stuff out there and you're just still like your fragile self. Yeah. And like, how could I put that in a sound?
Yeah.
And thankfully Andrew was game for it. But that's what I like, being able to really use sounds for very specific emotional purposes. And usually that is challenging to some of the players, and that, it's beyond the range where they're used to playing some things. Or using virtuosity. I love playing fast, but also I love that, the old time traditions like Baroque music. I am also a Baroque player.
Yeah. And
that kind of, Vivaldi and just sparkling, effervescent, ridiculously virtuosic string music I'm a huge fan of. As I am like Appalachian bluegrass, that fiddling and that kind of virtuosic tradition. And so, a lot of that finds its way into my music as well.
So that kind of brings me to my last question, which is, what is it like playing? I mean, and I know that you play lots of different styles of music, so this is a really huge oversimplification. But what's the difference for you as a performer when you're playing your own music that's sort of coming from the heart and coming from your own story, as opposed to playing music from the repertoire? Like, how is that different?
Well, I didn't realize how different it was until I started writing my own. And what had happened to me was, funnily enough, when I was in high school, I had such problems with tension, and I had huge levels of anxiety that was just caught up in my body. And while I played, though I could play on a high level, but it was always hampered by how tight I was in my body. And the only time that disappeared is when I was improvising.
Really?
And there are brain scans that they do on musicians where basically musicians that are improvising, they're using an entirely different part of their brain and in a more connected way. And so one of the things I did after going to Juilliard, which can be a very kind of pressure cooker kind of place, is to sort of remove the filter that was so tightly put on by myself and, you know, just by being in that environment of like, I got to be perfect. You know, everything's got to be perfect. Was I started improvising with my dad because my dad's a blues singer.
Oh, really?
So
Cool.
So I started, not by trade necessarily, but he, you know, in the 60s, you could find him downtown at some coffee place doing, you know, jamming and with beat poets and things like that. And he's always playing guitar. And I started improvising, and which then got me a gig improvising with a string orchestra that traveled with Savion Glover for a while.
Oh, wow.
And I just sort of slowly removed that filter. But when I started playing my own stuff, my playing changed completely because the sound of what you want always comes first in your ear. Often what happens when it's the opposite is that you see music on a page and you're trying so hard just to play what's on the page. And you're there's always this feeling of translation.
Yeah.
At least it was for me. There was something a little bit broken between the pipeline, between my hands and my brain and the sound I wanted. And in a way, by becoming a composer, I repaired the pipeline. And so now I could hear everything so clearly. When I'm playing my own stuff, I'm just hearing it and my hands are just doing it. And it's very natural feeling and I don't get tense. I have a way better sound. I can play faster, like all of these things. And then when I was conscious of that difference, then I started carrying that into my professional viola life as when I played everything else. I'm like, can I hear it clearly in my head? You know, can I feel it slightly ahead of time in my hands? Can I not get tensed up just because I'm going high? You know, just hear it, you know. And it sounds simple enough, but for string players, we have years and years of baggage of how you play. It's years and years of undoing that to do it. It's like, you know, really great drummers.
Yeah.
Really great drummers can't be tight. You just can't physically play fast if you're tight, you know. So it's just, it was actually having my son that also changed that because I couldn't practice loud in my apartment anymore at night when I was, you know, spending hours learning another new music piece. And I had to play with a practice mute, and it was the best thing for my playing because it allowed the sound comes instantaneously when you're using a practice mute, and it's not very loud, so you're not using your muscles to like try or force anything. And then I sort of made that regular practice, and you know, between that and playing my own stuff, sort of freed up my body and my playing and my sound, and just did a whole bunch of good things. But I just played my show at BAM the other day, and every time I play it, I'm reminded like why I still need to do my show, why I still need to play.
And by your show, you mean your solo show?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have an hour's worth of stuff where it's just me and a looper, and that's it.
Yeah.
And so and singing a little bit, and just realizing how one feeds the other. You know, it's just like Bach in church. God fed Bach, and he fed back with music, which then fed into all the music he would write every week for himself, and even non-secular music. I mean, there's an ebb and flow. You know, there's some weeks where I have to just write. Like right now, I'm under deadline, and I have to write as many hours a day as I can squeeze it in. And then there's some weeks where I'm just playing the viola, and I love them both.
Yeah. Jessica Meyer, thanks so much for sharing your story. It's been really interesting to hear about how you're kind of exploring this new path. I really appreciate you coming on.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
All right, everyone, that does it for this episode of Classical Classroom. For more Classroom, go to houstonpublicmedia.org/classroom. You'll find all of our social media there. Follow it with blind devotion. Email me at dclay@houstonpublicmedia.org. Subscribe to, rate us, and review us on the iTunes. Thanks to audio producer Todd, Electrotodd Hulslander, for twiddling knobs today. Thanks to Mark DiClaudio for his piercing MIDI eyes. Thanks to Jessica Meyer for being here today. Thanks to me for saying words. But most of all, thanks to you for listening. We'll catch you next time.